Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is the Ukraine War News segment for the 22nd of March 2023. Let's get straight to it, to the usual opening gambit. The Russian losses, as according to the Ukrainian official figures for the day before, all the usual caveats, inaccurate propaganda. Russia don't produce the same kind of figures. I think these are indicatively useful. Good to see the trends, and actually are much more accurate than people give them credit for. So high figures for the personnel losses, 920. We're getting towards the 1,000 mark, which is around about the record figure area. So 920 is a bad day for the Russians. 5 tanks and 8 APCs. That's slightly less, well, somewhat less than yesterday, but yesterday's figures were high. 5 and 8 are still useful figures. 5 tanks, 8 APCs, 3 artillery systems, and 2 MLRS. I've been talking about how I believe the Ukrainians have been targeting, specifically targeting artillery systems and MLRS units, and I think that has been borne out by some claims yesterday from other sources, and certainly by the figures. And this has continued today, although not as many pieces of artillery as yesterday. Still a couple of MLRS, which are always useful to take out. 2 anti-aircraft warfare systems, consistent numbers across the weeks there. Just a couple of those a day just does create quite a problem for the Russians, because these are often, but not always, expensive units that they can't easily replace. And a consistent degradation of that anti-aircraft capability is going to be very useful for a forthcoming offensive for the Ukrainians. 16 drones, 2 cruise missiles. There was a bit of an attack last night. About 21 drones were sent across, 16 were taken out. Talk about that in a second. A couple of cruise missiles, I think, towards Odessa. 6 vehicles and fuel tanks, all fuel tanks, 4 pieces of special equipment. So that's quite a number there. Starting to see a lot of pieces of special equipment taken out. I say a lot, like consistently small amount, but it's adding up cumulatively to quite a lot. Now, talking about defending the claim of these numbers, I'm not going to show you this video. It is pretty inappropriate. Trenches full of dead Russians, almost cinematic scenes. That video, you can see it in various places online. No Reports has it. Reportedly in Vodyany, south of Avdiivka, inflicted by the 35th Marine Brigade. They've taken, there's some videos that have come out in the last 24 hours of just a vast number of hits they've done with IEDs from drones. So the 35th doing quite a lot of damage around the Avdiivka area. Yes, some are still moving, but these Russians took quite a big hit, it seems. That video is incredible. So there's literally a whole trench just full of dead people, which is obviously, incredibly sad. These are human beings, right? But devastating loss of life. I think in that one just scan, there's probably a good 100 bodies there, without too much of a problem. And the reason I'm telling you that is, okay, when you start seeing these high figures, is there any basis for that claim? And you think, well, that's one trench in one place, just south of Avdiivka. Just one image, and that's 100 people, would be my guesstimation. And you're thinking, well, that's a tiny part of that entire 1,000-kilometer front line. It's just a few meters. So is 920 realistic? Yes, I would say so. That was a pretty devastating bit of drone footage there. Russian armor column destroyed reportedly in the Avdiivka area. So here we have, quite often you get, they do cut annoyingly. So you got that, and then it cuts, but that column is coming down there. Part of it gets hit over towards the right. Pretty big tossing of something there. I'm not sure if that's a turret or something else. And then the aftermath there, that's the Avdiivka area, something cooking off. Quite a bit of equipment lost there. Looks like sort of APCs and or tanks. We have self-propelled gun being hit, presumably by an Excalibur round. The reason I've included this is because when you're Excalibur rounds are fairly expensive, but when they're taking out pieces of artillery or SPGs, then that's pretty important. So here we have, I don't know if that looked in good order or not, that piece of equipment, but it is taken out by a single Excalibur round. And again, this goes back to, are they targeting using they have limited artillery ammunition, so it's about hitting things like SPGs and artillery pieces with one shot. And to do that, obviously, Excalibur is going to be your preferred munition. There's a report of a Ka-52 helicopter coming down as it hit the power lines in an occupied area of Ukraine somewhere. The crew didn't survive. That was March the 16th, so helicopter loss there. Now, speaking of helicopter losses, I want to correct myself from yesterday. One of the reports I shared with you yesterday was this claim here of this was supposed to be, or apparently was, an aircraft being taken out in the Donetsk region. Well, actually, there's footage now from a different point of view that shows that it's actually an SPG that was taken out. So a self-propelled gun, self-propelled mortar, sorry, that was destroyed. And you can see that the mountain bit to the left there. So we're pretty sure that that's what that was. So it wasn't yesterday. It wasn't an aircraft. I can't remember whether it was a jet. I was saying a Su-24 or something. I did report that, just sharing another source, but I just want to correct myself because I need to make sure that I am as accurate as possible. That was a self-propelled mortar and not an aircraft, which is one I was wondering why it wasn't appearing on the aircraft stats. Mariupol's been hit. Strong explosions are heard. It's been hit repeatedly day after day, as well as other places behind the line. But there was a lot of activity last night from the Russians. There was missile attacks on Odessa. I think that's where your cruise missiles are. I don't know the details of damage in Odessa, but certainly there was quite a large wave of drones, 21 Shahed 131, 136 drones sent from the Bryansk region, which is to the north of Ukraine, much nearer sort of Kyiv area. There were some interceptions, but a number of impacts reported too in terms of this drone strike. And again, not sure about those cruise missiles. Kyiv was hit. A three-story academic building of a lyceum was destroyed and hit the area of Rzhushchiv in Kyiv. So there's a picture of the damage done, pictures of the damage done there. Yeah, you can say, are these the right munitions to be using if they are inaccurately hitting academic buildings? I'm sure that's not what Russia would be wanting to target. And if it is that war crime? All that kind of same conversation again. On the other hand, Russian occupation officials in Crimea have reported that 3 Ukrainian naval drones, so these are USVs, unmanned sea vehicles, entered Sevastopol harbor earlier this morning and were quickly detected and destroyed. In fact, there's footage of one of them on fire, very poor quality footage, but that is one of the drones, I believe, on fire. Now, they said they detected and destroyed 2 drones. However, it's quite... Now, that's a fairly significant explosion. There were also reports of aerial drones as well in Sevastopol. So it could be that all the sea drones were taken out, but maybe an aerial one hits. I mean, the Russians claimed that everything was taken out, but it sounds like that there was definitely some kind of major explosion. That was too close for that to be an aerial drone quite high up in the sky. That is very close to the ground, and it sounds a bit like something hit. So that's the end of these kind of hits and losses. We'll wait to see what the outcome is of both the drone attack and cruise missile attack on Ukraine, but also that attack on Sevastopol, both the aerial drones and sea drones, because I think that's pretty significant. Just on a random other thing, that bird flu has been detected. 8 people have been admitted to a hospital in occupied Kherson. I believe possibly also Crimea, bird flu there. But then actually there's bird flu in Peru. Loads of sea lions have died. I think there's bird flu in America maybe and elsewhere around the world. So there's a few. It's not uncommon, but it does pop up now and again. We'll see if that develops into something more worrying. Okay, onto military aid. First batches of the 122 mil projectiles to join 120 and 125 mil projectiles have been manufactured by Ukrainian, it's Ukroboronprom. I think they changed their name now just today. There's some news came out about how they're restructuring their defense manufacturer um, along corporate lines. This is really useful. They're manufacturing these in conjunction with another NATO country. Don't know who that is. Probably Poland. You'd expect it's going to be somewhere nearby. Poland seems a pretty good option. They are making munitions that they desperately, desperately need. The question is scale, especially if you're just starting up manufacturing these. What is the scale like? Because you are going to need thousands and thousands a day. But still, it's a move in the right direction. There's some talk, I don't know if I've got it on one of my links, there's some talk about how Ukraine, I think it might be in the drone part, Ukraine feel that Russia were much quicker off the mark in scaling up and getting onto a war footing in terms of manufacturing armaments, and Ukraine are playing catch up there. Here is armored personnel character operated by the Ukrainian Naval Infantry, so the Marines. It's estimated that 20 to 30 such of these were donated in autumn from Finland. We talk so often about American ones because there's American dominated media. So a lot of talk about Bradleys and Strikers and X, Y, and Z, but actually there are APZs and other bits of equipment from a number of other countries that are going to be thrown into the mix as well. And talking about the mix, there's lots of footage coming out on a consistent basis of the equipment being used, being trained on in Germany. Here we've got Hummers and Striker here. So that Striker has quite a bit of equipment slammed on top of it. Looks pretty interesting. They are pretty significant vehicles, have quite some capability. They'll be useful, of course, they will for the Ukrainians. So a lot of equipment on show that will soon be on Ukrainian territory involved in the counteroffensive. Good to see them getting trained up on those. Latvia to donate medical equipment worth nearly 321,000 US dollars. That's actually come from their Ministry of Health, and it was rubber stamped by the government. That's really good news. I mean, it's not a massive amount of value considering the whole scheme of things, but super, super useful. Goodness me. Like, that's incredibly generous of Latvia. Those Baltic states really are stepping up. Now, British Minister of Defence has stated during a Q&A today that they will be, or yesterday, they will be providing Ukraine not only with the Challenger 2 tanks, but armor-piercing depleted uranium rounds alongside them. And this has caused something of an uproar with the Russians. Now, it is excellent ammo, as Thomas C. Tyner says, and capable of destroying every Russian tank. But out of the tanks being delivered to Ukraine, the German and Portuguese Leopard 2A6 have by far the most deadly gun. That Leopard version has a RH-120 or L55A1 gun, currently the most powerful tank gun in all of NATO. So that's interesting. But the uranium rods, nonetheless, they use uranium that is particularly dense, much denser than the armor that it's going to be hitting, and so therefore it's like a knife through butter. So is very, very effective. Now, Russia has reacted to this. Putin say Russia will respond if UK supplies depleted uranium shells to Ukraine. Comments began to circulate on Russian social media channels on Tuesday, and the Russian leader chose to refer to them after a meeting with Xi. If all this happens, Russia will have to respond accordingly, given that the West collectively is already beginning to use weapons with a nuclear component, he said. Britain responded by accusing Russia of deliberately trying to disinform. Depleted uranium, quote, has nothing to do with nuclear weapons and capabilities, the UK Ministry of Defence said, and said it was a standard component used by militaries, including Russia itself, and we'll come on to that. Russia knows this, the spokesman added, this is about controlling the information space. This is about worrying the Russian internal audience with claims that the UK are escalating here. And actually, these are bog standard or fairly standard munitions used in tanks. And in fact, Russia already uses them. But as I say, I'll come on to that. Depleted uranium is a byproduct of the enrichment process, which makes nuclear fuel and weapons, and so is less radioactive than the naturally occurring metal, although concerns remain about its toxicity. The waste product is used to make penetrating tank shells because it is 70% more dense than lead. don't know that denser actually, rather than more dense. But there you go, grammar Nazi talking about denazification. Maybe I should stop doing that. Yes, Russia do use depleted uranium munitions. Like America, Russian tanks are now shooting depleted uranium bullets, says the National Interest.org. Those shells are used in uh, by the Russians, and I think apparently have been used in Ukraine as well. So Russia have absolutely no uh, no right to say that, to get on their high horse. But there you go. I'm not sure bullets is the right word, but Pentagon has announced today that they have decided to begin providing Ukraine with refurbished M1A2 Abrams main battle tanks instead of factory new M1s, so that they can be transferred to Ukraine by the autumn of this year. Now, big news. There's all this talk about what Abrams to send Ukraine, because they don't want to let Ukraine have the depleted uranium armor Abrams, because they don't want that getting into the hands of the Russians if they lose the odd tank here and there to the Russians. So they're manufacturing new ones without that armor. But I believe that now they're looking to refurbish new ones rather than refurbish old ones rather than manufacture new ones, because it'll get to the Ukrainians quicker. And I don't know whether what they'll do with the new ones that they build, whether they backfill them or give them as well on top of the ones. There will most likely be refurbished export models from Saudi Arabia or Iraq instead of US Army variants with the depleted uranium armor, which we are not allowed to export to foreign countries. So there you go. That's really good news that the Ukrainians will get those tanks sooner, especially when we consider that this war, lots of people now are saying that we're in this for the long haul. We'll get onto that when we start talking about China. Okay, in the next few weeks, the US will send a first Patriot system to Ukraine. Air Force personnel have adapted very fast to the system, US officials said. So the Ukrainians have worked really hard to train very, very quickly, and have done so very well, apparently. So they are going to be getting Patriots sooner than they were initially hoping. Now, talking about US aid, let's start getting aid into context. I know there are some naysayers, particularly in the fringe area of the GOP, the Republican Party in America. Now, this is indeed incorrect as well. Anyway, I'm going to just qualify these stats. So, as according to Statista here, in 1 year annually, the Russia-Ukraine war is costing $46.6 billion to the US, where the war annually. So where annually the Afghanistan war cost $43.4 billion, but actually, even though it says only 10 years there, that was a 20-year war. And the stats I have is that is half the amount it actually was. So it cost about 100 billion a year. So this war is costing half the amount of the Afghan war is, and that lasted 20 years. We'll come on to qualify those claims. Vietnam War, 90 billion a year. Iraq War, 125 billion annually. And the Korean War, interestingly, was the most expensive. This is all, configured to 2022 prices, $138 billion. Well, this Forbes article, which, if it allows me to see it, here we go, gives you some details on the Afghan war. So, in the 20 years since September 11th, 2001, the United States has spent more than $2 trillion on the war in Afghanistan, which is quite a lot of money. That's 300. Oh dear, sorry, I had to disable my ad blocker. That's $300 million per day, every day for 2 decades, or $50,000 for each. Oh, goodness. Don't you hate adverts? See, this is why I disabled my ad blocker. So to continue, that's $50,000 for each of Afghanistan's 40 million people. In basic terms, Uncle Sam spent more keeping the Taliban at bay than the net worth of Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, and the 30 richest billionaires in America combined. Those headline numbers include $800 billion in direct war fighting costs and $85 billion to train the vanquished Afghan army, which folded in the week since the Pentagon's sudden early July closure of Bagram Air Force Base, so on and so forth. And it gives you all the details of the vast amounts of money spent on the Afghan war over 20 years. And on those figures, the Russia Ukraine war is half the amount annually as the Afghan war. And that went on for 20 years. So, this, and considering the Afghan war won't be costing that now, in budgetary terms, actually, technically, from pulling out, if we're going to be really simplistic here, the US is spending half the amount it was previously. So so this Russia-Ukraine war is a relatively cheap war, and in budgetary terms, they are saving money compared to what they were. Of course, some will argue, well, they shouldn't be spending any on the Ukraine war. That's a whole other conversation. But my point here is to get things into context and to understand the figures somewhat. Anyway, Japan will allocate $30 million of non-lethal weapons. So that is great, brilliant, but obviously not quite the amount that the US has been contributing for Ukraine, said Prime Minister of Japan Fumio Kishida. Of course, Japan have a very interesting position geopolitically. They are right next to China. They're very worried about the Indo-Pacific. They are trying to put things in place to ensure the stability of the entire region. So they'll be taking Ukraine into account there and trying to work out whether they put all the money over there or keep the money over here, worried particularly about China. But anyway, it was pretty good that Ukraine received that surprise visit from the Japanese premier there. Okay, speaking about China, China has sold more than $12 million worth of drones and drone parts to Russia since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, according to official Russian customs data from third-party data provider, as in the New York Times. Now, one has to be careful here. This isn't necessarily the Russian state doing this, but this is China delivering drones through commercial off-the-shelf drone suppliers to Russia. But that's a significant amount of money. In fact, speaking of that, it's worth noting that a large proportion of drones find their way to the Russians and the Ukrainians through donations and third-party organizations and individuals. So Ukraine has relied on donations and drones from third-party organizations and individuals, which has meant its troops use DJI, so that's a Chinese drone manufacturer, drones on the front lines too. Advisors estimate that half of Ukrainian troops' stocks are made up of Ukrainian drones and half are foreign ones, mostly those made by DJI. In place of donations, Russia has been able to purchase a consistent, if not massive, supply of drones from China. The direct sales by Chinese exporters, industry experts say, are only one part of a wider effort to procure the drones from nearby markets where they can be bought off store shelves. You also have United 24, which last time I looked had was it $200 million plus worth of drones for Ukraine. And my question is, where are those drones? Now, Ukraine are calling out for drones. And I was speculating yesterday because there was in one of the articles I shared with you, there's talk about these whole new drone battalions that have been set up ready for the counter offensive. And I wonder whether much of that money and those drones, I don't know whether the money is raised and given to Ukraine or whether the money is buying drones and the drones are given to Ukraine. But either way, I wonder whether a lot of the United 24 money raised is going to support the counteroffensive rather than piling drones in to the front line. But I need to look into that. It's just a lot of speculation for me there. US imposes new sanctions over involvement in Iranian drone production. The sanctions have been imposed against 4 companies and 3 individuals from Iran and Turkey over their involvement in purchasing equipment to support Iran's drone and arms development programs. And lastly, on the military aid front, Russian TMM-3 heavy brigade mechanized bridge layers being transferred to Russian units stationed in Belarus. This is interesting. Why would they put their bridge layers in Belarus? Belarus is north, obviously, of Ukraine. to the northwest. Now, in that northwestern area, there are a lot of rivers and marshes. And if the Russians were to attack from Belarus, they would need a huge amount of bridge laying equipment. So the fact that these are being sent to Belarus does support the hypothesis that Russia are preparing for an offensive from Belarus. But there's lots of evidence to also suggest that they just wouldn't be able to do that, not only because of the terrain, but they just don't have the troops to meaningfully attack from Belarus in terms of their own troops and Belarusian troops. Okay, now going on to geopolitics, let's see what we have for you. Hungary again. Hungary will not support any significant movement of Ukraine towards NATO and the EU until the rights of Transcarpathian Hungarians are restored. So they're obviously using that as a bargaining chip to. There's a lot of Transcarpathian Hungarians living basically in Ukraine, in areas of Ukraine. So I don't know what the issue there is, but they want some kind of, I don't know, they want something in return for doing the right thing. Prime Minister of Japan, as I've mentioned, Kishida visited Bucha. Now, it's important that he visited Ukraine. Just it's important anyway, but it's significant. I think it's the first time a Japanese premier has visited a country at war. Certainly, it was historic for a number of reasons. So that was really important, and there were lots of quite striking photographs that harken back to post World War II. There's interesting parallels going on in some ways, or maybe juxtapositions. But yeah, so it's super important and good to see him there. Putin will be arrested if he comes to Ireland, says the Department of Justice. So lots of talk from different countries about what will happen in terms of the ICC arrest warrant that has been issued to Putin. Ireland has said, and it's a shame because I'm sure he was looking forward to that St. Patrick's Day, in Dublin next year. So I don't think he'll be there now. But anyway, he'll be arrested if he goes to Ireland. Now, big thing, and I talked about this yesterday. I'm really happy that quite a few commentators have been talking about this as well, which is that I was saying Xi Jinping has gone to Moscow. He will be getting out of that meeting much more than Russia, what Russia will be getting. So he's in a power position, and that whole kind of wheeler dealer activity that was going on in Moscow would have been much to the benefit of China. So this is next to saying Russia becomes a resource colony of China, and yuan will be the main currency of trade in the country by the end of 2023. Russia offers China natural resources in exchange for support, which the Kremlin considers critical to the continuation of the war in Ukraine, a source close to the Kremlin told the Financial Times. Last year, Russia increased its oil exports to China by nearly 10%, coal by 21%, and gas by 1.5 times, becoming its largest supplier for the first time. China, in return, sent $4.8 billion worth of electronics and technology to Russia, replacing Western companies that left. Russia, Putin said during the meeting with Xi, intends to provide uninterrupted oil supplies to China, as well as sharply increase gas exports. The total volume of gas supplies by 2030 will be at least 98 billion cubic meters plus 100 million tons of LNG, Putin said. The volume Putin announced is all the gas that Russia, according to the plan, should produce by 2030, Interfax notes. So this is like literally China will be the sole recipient of Russian hydrocarbons, at least if those figures are to be kind of trusted. The logic of events dictates that we are fully becoming a resource colony of China. Our servers will be from Huawei. China will receive gas via the power of Siberia. By the end of 2023, the yuan will be our main currency of trade, said the FT source. The sanctions have further highlighted the asymmetrical nature of Russian-Chinese relations. A senior fellow of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, it's hard to hide the fact that Russia is now a junior partner. Massive. And indeed, this thread, I don't know if it's a bit long for me to share with you. I'm generally skeptical about official statements, says Sam Green, from summits, especially between unaccountable autocrats. But even so, the statements coming from the Xi-Putin summit in Moscow are remarkable, mostly because they are so one-sided. First things first, the Chinese peace plan is a nothing burger. Putin said it's a good place to start when the West and Kyiv are ready, knowing full well that a plan that leaves Ukrainian territory in Russian hands is a non-starter. Unless something surprising happens when Xi calls Zelensky, this is a gift to Putin, essentially permission from Beijing to keep fighting. It is, though, Xi's only gift to Putin. Xi praised Putin, touted strong relations with Russia, unity in the UNSC, and promised coordination on IT and natural resources trade. And that's it. Putin, by contrast, was almost obscenely generous, and not just with his praise. Let's start with energy. He pledged completion of the Strength of Siberia 2 pipeline and more throughout to come for uninterrupted oil and gas deliveries to China. While that might sound like a boon for Russia export revenue, it replaces structural dependence on Europe with structural dependence on China at a time when Russia is a price taker for hydrocarbons. That's a strategic win for China. What he means here is that basically Russia aren't really setting the price for their hydrocarbons. They're a price taker. They are like other people are setting the price, and they're forced to pay to sell that at that price because they've got no other options. Sanctions are in place. They can't sell to Europe. They can't sell to many other places around the world. So they are being forced to sell to China, and China get to set those prices. And so, yeah, brilliant. They do get export revenue, but it's at a much lower value than what they would have done if they hadn't invaded. Further, Putin announced a reorientation of agricultural trade towards China and a strategic role for China in developing Russia's Far East and High North. I talked about this before, how China would be happy if Russia lost the war because they'll be helping themselves not only to their energy, but also agriculturally or regionally up in those regions that are much closer to China in arguably culturally as well. A move Putin's own security apparatus has long resisted for obvious reasons. Again, strategic wins for China. Further still, Russia offered to begin using yuan in transactions with non-Western countries. I'm not convinced this will ever happen, but if it does, it strengthens the yuan while undermining the ruble. Note, Xi didn't offer to start using rubles, and Russia offered Chinese companies first dibs on the assets of departing Western companies, again strengthening China's presence in Russia. So, like I said before, Russia sweeps in and picks up the pieces. The West many corporations have left Russia, leaving behind X, Y, and Z, and China gets to sweep in and take advantage of that. Again, strengthening China's presence in Russia with no reciprocal strengthening of Russia's presence in China. That's the asymmetry that you got to know. To be clear, there are situational benefits for Moscow of each of these things and in others, but I'm struggling to come up with something that Xi wants from Putin that he didn't get. And the list of things Putin wants from Xi and didn't get is considerable. While were undoubtedly agreements we are not meant to know about, there is no indication here of significant increase in military support for Russia, nor even of a willingness on Xi's part to ramp up diplomatic support. A swing and a miss for Putin. While Putin offered privileged positions and subsidies, Xi didn't actually come bearing investment. The most he put on the table economically was trade facilitation. Rhetorically, too, the summit was lopsided. Putin praised Xi's successes in China and its leading role in the world. Xi said that Putin was a reliable partner. Even Xi's endorsement of Putin's electoral chances in 2024 was frankly humiliating, coming from a man who doesn't even have to pretend to win an election. Putin greeted Xi with a rhetorical bear hug. Xi gave Putin a pat on the head and told him to run along now and play. This summit then brings home exactly how much Putin has lost prior to the war. Even after 2014, Putin occupied a position of strategic maneuverability. He could arbitrage between East and West, reaping windfalls for his regime along the way. That's all gone now. Putin tells his people he's fighting for Russia's sovereignty. In truth, he's mortgaged the Kremlin to Beijing. The question now is one for Xi. What will he do with his newest acquisition? Oof, that is a thread. And I think it was worth me sharing that with you because I think this is super, super important. This war has a chance of going on a very long time. The last words of the Ukraine the Latest podcast yesterday were, well, we could be in this studio in 10 years' time. When they were evaluating that China has essentially could be a close partner of Russia here. However, Russia is a Chinese colony, as this thread says. What does that mean for the war going forward? It could mean that the war is prolonged. It could well mean that. I'm not sure. I don't know how much military assistance China will give, but if it gives financial assistance, then that gets turned into military assistance. Uh, but if Russia is struggling to make tanks and APCs and IFVs and guns, then where can they spend that money? How can they get that stuff? They still need that stuff. So I don't know. Lots of things going on in my head as to the ramifications of this closer partnership, but it's absolutely certain that China, no matter what happens, China come off better here. So, like I've said before, if Russia lose, China get to sweep in and pick up all the pieces and take advantage of Russia. And if Russia win, China are there reaping the benefits of cheap hydrocarbons and deals that suit them with Russia. So, win-win for China. Um, and last thing to say is there are growing tensions on the border between Azerbaijan and Armenia. There are columns of military vehicles going all over the shop from both sides. And now Azerbaijan has cut off the gas supplies from Armenia to Nagorno-Karabakh, which is a region that's contested. During the night, Artsakh information headquarters say. So there is an escalation of activity or escalation of bellicose activity, I guess, going on in that area, one to keep an eye on. Anyway, thank you for watching. That's the news update. It's a bit longer today, as it quite often is at the moment. Just so much to talk about, and it's really important to talk about China. So I dwelled on that a little bit. But thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. All the ways you can support the channel are in the description below, and they are really appreciated.